If there's one name in English history that conjures an image of tyranny and incompetence, it's King John. While most remember him as the cartoonish villain in Robin Hood tales, the truth about his reign is far more horrifying. His rule was a catastrophic blend of greed, betrayal, and spectacular failures. King John was born on December 24th, 1166, the youngest of 5 sons to King Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most famous and formidable couples in medieval history. Being the youngest son of such a powerful family was both a blessing and a curse. On the one hand, John was surrounded by wealth, privilege, and opportunity. On the other hand, his position made him almost irrelevant in the grand scheme of royal succession, a predicament that would leave him insecure, embittered, and dangerously ambitious. John's family was a textbook example of dysfunction. His father, King Henry II, was a brilliant but ruthless ruler who governed an empire that stretched from the Scottish borders to the Pyrenees. His mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, was equally formidable, a political mastermind who had been married to the King of France before divorcing him to marry Henry. The marriage of these two titans was turbulent, to say the least, marked by power struggles, betrayals, and open rebellion. As the youngest son, John earned the nickname Lackland because he was not expected to inherit significant lands or titles. His older brothers, Henry the Young King, Richard the Lionheart, and Geoffrey, overshadowed him in every way. While they were being groomed to rule vast territories, John was left with scraps. This sense of inadequacy and neglect likely fueled his lifelong resentment and ruthless ambition. Family life was anything but harmonious. Henry II's heavy-handed rule alienated his sons, who frequently rebelled against him. Eleanor, frustrated with Henry's control, encouraged these rebellions, creating a toxic environment of mutual distrust and backstabbing. John's older brothers openly defied their father, while John, the youngest and least threatening, remained loyal, earning Henry's favor. This loyalty, however, was less a virtue and more a calculated move by John to position himself as his father's trusted ally. But John's loyalty was as fleeting as his principles. When the opportunity arose, he turned on his family just as they had turned on each other. His early years were marked by a pattern of opportunism and betrayal that would define his entire life. For instance, during his teenage years, Henry II granted John castles and lands in an attempt to placate him. These gifts only deepened the resentment among his older brothers, particularly Richard, who saw John as an unworthy upstart. One of the most significant turning points in John's early life came during the rebellion of 1173 to 1174, when his older brothers, led by Henry the Young King, rose against their father. John, only 7 years old at the time, was too young to participate, but the rebellion's fallout would shape his future. His father's ability to crush the uprising solidified Henry's control, but it also deepened the rifts within the family. John watched and learned, internalizing the lesson that loyalty was a weakness and power was the only currency that mattered. John's relationship with his mother, Eleanor, was equally complex. Eleanor was imprisoned by Henry II for supporting her son's rebellion, spending 16 years under house arrest. Despite this, she remained a formidable figure in John's life. After Henry's death, Eleanor played a crucial role in securing Richard's succession and later in managing John's claim to the throne. However, their relationship was never warm. Eleanor's attention was primarily focused on Richard, whom she favored as the more capable and charismatic son. John, ever the outsider, resented this favoritism and developed a reputation for being petulant, jealous, and vindictive. The family dynamics reached a boiling point after the death of Henry the Young King in 1183. With one rival out of the way, John saw an opportunity to increase his influence. Henry II granted him additional lands and titles, including the lordship of Ireland. This new responsibility was supposed to be a stepping stone for John, but it quickly became a disaster. His tenure in Ireland was marked by arrogance, incompetence, and a complete inability to win the respect of the local lords. It was an early sign of the mismanagement that would plague his reign. John's rise to power was as chaotic and controversial as the rest of his life. As the youngest son of Henry II, he was never expected to inherit the throne. Yet through a combination of strategic opportunism, family tragedy, and outright treachery, he clawed his way to the top. His ascent was less a story of destiny and more a tale of ruthless ambition and relentless scheming. The first major step in John's rise came in 1185, when his father appointed him Lord of Ireland. This was meant to be a proving ground for the young prince, a chance to demonstrate his leadership skills. Instead, it became an unmitigated disaster. John's arrogance and lack of political savvy alienated the Irish nobility, who were accustomed to a more collaborative style of governance. Rather than building alliances, John insulted the local lords, mocked their customs, and squandered his resources. His failure in Ireland earned him a reputation for incompetence, a label that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Despite this early failure, John's fortunes improved after the death of his older brothers. Henry the Young King's death in 1183 removed one rival, while Geoffrey's death in 1186 eliminated another. This left Richard as the primary heir to the throne, with John as the next in line. However, John's relationship with Richard was fraught with tension. Richard, known as the Lionheart for his military prowess, was everything John was not: charismatic, capable, and beloved by his soldiers. John, in contrast, was seen as a schemer and a coward. When Richard ascended the throne in 1189, John was granted additional lands and titles. However, his ambition could not be contained. While Richard was away on the Third Crusade, John saw an opportunity to seize power. He allied himself with Philip II of France and attempted to undermine Richard's authority. This betrayal nearly succeeded, but Richard's unexpected return in 1194 put an end to John's coup. Richard forgave his brother, but the damage to John's reputation was done. Richard's death in 1199 marked the turning point in John's rise to power. With no legitimate heirs, the crown passed to John, despite rival claims from his nephew, Arthur of Brittany. John's claim was strengthened by his mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, who worked tirelessly to secure his succession. However, his path to the throne was far from smooth. Arthur, backed by Philip II of France, challenged John's rule, leading to a protracted conflict that would define the early years of his reign. When John finally ascended to the throne after Richard's death, the stage was set for one of the most catastrophic reigns in English history. If his earlier failures were foreshadows, his actual reign was a parade of disasters that would have made even the most cynical monarch cringe. But here's the real kicker. Despite the fact that John's reign was one continuous train wreck, he somehow managed to make it all about him. In John's mind, it wasn't about England or its people. It was about his personal vendettas and ego. And this is where it all went from bad to worse. The first major debacle came in the form of his nephew, Arthur of Brittany. Arthur was next in line to inherit the throne, at least according to some claims. And it didn't take long for John to decide that this was a problem he needed to solve. After all, why let a young, rightful heir live when you could just have him disappear? As the story goes, John, being John, likely had Arthur murdered, though the details remain a bit murky. What's crystal clear, however, is that John's actions sparked a massive revolt, and a long-standing grudge between him and his nobles that would never be fully healed. But murder wasn't the only thing John was good at. Oh no, he was also a master of losing territory. He inherited a vast collection of lands, including significant portions of France, which had been held by his father and brother Richard. However, John somehow managed to lose nearly all of it to King Philip II of France, a monarch who was, in comparison, quite competent. By the end of John's reign, he had managed to lose Normandy, Anjou, Maine, and several other key French territories that had been English for generations. And the worst part, John didn't seem to care. He would whine and complain about these losses, but instead of taking decisive action to regain the land, he opted to focus on other petty concerns. His foreign policy was a disaster. His inability to manage international relations was breathtaking, and his total disregard for his people's needs only made things worse. If there's one thing John's reign is remembered for, it's the Magna Carta. This document, forced from John's hand by a furious group of barons, would go down in history as one of the most significant legal documents in history. But here's the funny thing. John didn't just give the Magna Carta. He was forced to sign it, and he hated every second of it. He wasn't just dragged into signing it. He was practically dragged kicking and screaming. This wasn't some benevolent king granting rights to his people. No, John was a tyrant who had so severely alienated the nobility that he had no choice but to cede power. So, let's break this down. By the time 1215 rolled around, John had pissed off just about every major noble in England. His massive tax hikes to fund his failed military campaigns had created an uprising among his barons. And with his French losses still fresh in everyone's minds, The barons were not in the mood for any more of John's incompetence. These barons, tired of John's disastrous leadership, came together and forced him to sign the Magna Carta, a document that sought to limit the absolute power of the crown and ensure that no monarch could act without the consent of the people. Now, for the record, let's be clear. The Magna Carta wasn't this noble, democratic gesture on John's part. It wasn't a case of a benevolent ruler trying to grant more freedoms to his people. In reality, the Magna Carta was a desperate, humiliating concession. John signed it under duress, and within weeks, he had already broken most of its clauses. He had no intention of honoring the terms of the Magna Carta. He signed it to buy time and avoid an all-out rebellion. And guess what? It didn't work. In fact, the signing of the Magna Carta was the beginning of an even more chaotic chapter in John's reign. The First Barons' War soon followed, as John promptly violated the Magna Carta, and the barons had had enough. The war that erupted was a disaster for John, and he was forced to retreat. The barons, energized by their newfound power and emboldened by John's failure to uphold his word, continued to challenge his authority. John was like a cornered animal, lashing out at any and everyone. But it was clear that his reign was crumbling. And the worst part, John had no idea how to fix it. The very document that was supposed to give him some stability ended up hastening his downfall. If ever there was a moment in history when a king's arrogance and incompetence came to bite him back, it was when John signed the Magna Carta and then ignored it almost immediately. Now, let's talk about how John handled all of this, like a petulant child. He was constantly at odds with his barons, unable to maintain any form of peace or cooperation. He didn't just fail to inspire loyalty, he actively bred resentment. By the time the First Barons' War wrapped up, John's reputation as one of the most despised monarchs in English history was solidified. And the Magna Carta, that symbol of legal progress, was more a reflection of John's complete failure as a ruler than anything else. John's downfall was as messy and undignified as the rest of his reign. The truth is, the end came swiftly, but not before a final series of humiliations. He spent the last years of his reign desperately trying to maintain control, clinging to his throne with a grip so tight that it could only end in tragedy. And tragedy it was. By this point, John had alienated just about every person of importance in his kingdom. His barons hated him, his nobles despised him, and his people couldn't care less about a king who had done nothing but wreak havoc. But perhaps the most fitting ending for a monarch like John came in the form of illness. In 1216, John succumbed to dysentery, probably one of the most humiliating ways for a ruler to die, especially given that the country was still in turmoil due to his mismanagement. The death of King John wasn't just the end of a reign. It was the end of a king whose incompetence, cruelty, and arrogance had turned England into a kingdom on the brink of collapse. King John of England's legacy remains a grim testament to the perils of ambition, poor leadership, and unchecked power. As the youngest son of Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine, John's reign is often considered one of the darkest chapters in English history, full of blunders, lost territories, and a reputation for cruelty and ineptitude. Despite being overshadowed by his more famous older brothers, John harbored dreams of power and glory. His rise to the throne was marked not by a natural progression or inheritance, but by tragedy, manipulation, and a series of circumstances that pushed him toward the throne. He may not have been born with the expectation of becoming king, but once he did, his reign quickly spiraled into chaos, largely due to his inability to manage his emotions, his court, and the kingdom. King John's struggles began long before he ascended the throne. As the youngest son of Henry II, he was constantly overshadowed by his more charismatic and capable brothers. With his father's empire sprawling across much of Western Europe, there was little left for John to inherit, and the lack of significant land holdings meant he had to fight for recognition. Over time, the resentment between him and his family deepened, particularly with his brother Richard the Lionheart, whose fame and strength cast an ever-present shadow over John's ambitions. This toxic family dynamic was compounded by a series of betrayals. John often aligned himself with his father, but this loyalty wasn't based on devotion. Rather, it was a calculated move to improve his position. He actively undermined his siblings, participating in backroom politics and court intrigue. When his older brother Richard went off on crusade, John saw the perfect opportunity to act on his ambition, forming an alliance with the French king in a bid to wrest control of the kingdom from his absent sibling. But John's failure to secure loyalty through strategic alliances and military prowess would be his downfall. His plans were short-sighted, and his inability to maintain the support of his subjects and allies led to a deepening instability within the kingdom. Once John became king after the death of his brother Richard, the situation in England was rife for conflict. The young monarch faced resistance from several fronts: foreign pressures from France, and internal dissent from his nobles. His tendency to make decisions based on impulse and self-interest alienated many of his key supporters. One of John's earliest missteps as king came when he lost vast swathes of French territory that had been in English hands for generations. The loss of Normandy, in particular, would become a symbol of his failure as a ruler. These territories were crucial to the monarchy's wealth and influence, and their loss not only hurt England economically, but also embarrassed the crown. The inability to regain these lands was a defining failure that left John vulnerable to the barons who were already dissatisfied with his reign. The frustration over John's foreign policy, combined with his inability to control his own nobility, quickly led to unrest. Taxation was raised to fund the king's failing military ventures, and this burden on the barons only exacerbated the discontent that simmered beneath the surface. In many ways, John's reign can be seen as one long conflict between a king who sought absolute control and a nobility determined to assert their own power. But John never grasped the fundamental principle of monarchy, that power must be balanced between ruler and subject. His arrogance made him incapable of fostering cooperation, and his court was a mirror of his inability to manage his kingdom. By the time of John's death in 1216, England was a fractured kingdom. The barons, energized by their newfound power, had rebelled against him, and John was in retreat. Even the church, which had been a significant ally to the monarchy, had turned against him. The signing of the Magna Carta, far from stabilizing his reign, only hastened his downfall. The king's attempts to regain control culminated in the First Barons' War, which ended in a humiliating defeat for John. John's final years were marked by desperation. His health was failing, and the nation he had tried to rule with an iron fist was slipping away. In 1216, he died from dysentery, a fate that seemed as ignoble as his reign. The death of King John marked the end of an era, and his son, Henry III, would inherit a fractured kingdom that had been left on the brink of collapse. In the centuries since his death, King John's reign has become synonymous with failure. His rule was characterized by an almost complete lack of foresight, a willingness to betray even those closest to him, and a tragic inability to secure the stability of his kingdom. John's reign is a reminder of the perils of unchecked power, of a monarch who thought only of his own survival, even at the expense of his people and the state. Do you think King John was a product of his time, or was he just a king blinded by his own ego? How do you think his reign would have turned out if he had seen beyond his own narrow vision for power? If you're intrigued by this historical tale, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment below.